Hello, this is UCL Uncovering Politics, and this week we're looking at relationships between governments and private sector suppliers. Why do they exist? What forms do they take? And how well do they work? Hello, my name is Alan Rennick, and welcome to UCL Uncovering Politics, the podcast of the School of Public Policy and Department of Political Science at University College London. Now, no one would claim that the subject of contracts between governments and private sector suppliers is all that sexy. But the last 2 years of the COVID crisis have certainly revealed its importance. In the earliest weeks of the pandemic, back in 2020, governments around the world scrambled to secure enough PPE, hospital ventilators, and COVID tests. Then there was the race to buy up vaccines. In recent weeks, shortages of testing kits have been back in the headlines. Here in the UK, vaccine purchasing is held up as exemplary, while contracting for PPE remains mired in allegations of cronyism. But controversies over government contracting are far from new. Debates about the merits or otherwise of the contracting out of public services and of public-private partnerships have been running for decades, and scandals over nepotism and revolving doors between the public and private sectors have been familiar for a lot longer than that. On the other hand, of course, many would say that close cooperation between governments and private sector suppliers has brought innumerable benefits. Well, in this, our first episode of 2022, we thought it was time to take a good look at such cooperation. And to do so, I'm delighted to be joined by two fantastic experts. Dr. Eleanor Woodhouse is lecturer in public policy in the UCL Department of Political Science and an expert in, among other things, public-private partnerships. In 2021, she published with colleagues a book with Cambridge University Press called Partnership Communities, Public-Private Partnerships and Non-Market Infrastructure Development Around the World. And Alice Moore is a PhD student in the UCL Department of Political Science. Her research investigates the role of trust and relationships in the delivery of outsourced public services and the effects on competition for public contracts and on the quality of the services provided. She's also a research officer at the Centre for Analysis of Risk and Regulation at the London School of Economics. Ellie and Alice, welcome to you both to UCL Uncovering Politics. And let's start with, I guess, the most fundamental question here. Why do governments actually invite private sector companies to provide public services, public infrastructure in the first place? Alice, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. So I think the trend towards inviting private sector suppliers to get involved in public services and public infrastructure kind of began in the 1980s and 90s. And it was really stimulated by renewed interest in free market economics and particularly the power of competition to produce good public services and positive results overall. So really, I think competition is one of the key rationales for involving the private sector in public services. There's a criticism at this time of government organisations that are unresponsive to citizens, to public interest, and this is seen as a result of the fact that there's no competition in the public sector. So this is probably one of the founding rationales for inviting private sector companies into this arena. There are other arguments as well, such as accessing expertise that the government doesn't have, perhaps quickly responding, as we've seen during the pandemic, to resourcing issues. You know, the public sector can't necessarily quickly mobilise, so inviting the private sector can help them kind of respond to that. And also some people argue that the profit motive will produce kind of higher performance. So the fact that people in private sector companies have a stake in the profits and the outcomes, in contrast to public organisations, this will lead them to kind of perform better. So those are the kind of, I would say, stated aims of contracting and the reasons that the private sector got involved in government services in the first place.
That's very helpful, Alice. Thank you. Ali, would you add anything to that?
Yes, I guess quickly, I think Alice did a great job in summarising why the private sector is brought in. I guess I could maybe quickly point to one of the kind of most important non-stated reasons for using private investment and private partners as part of delivering infrastructure. And that is precisely the fact that one of the kind of biggest attractions from the point of view of the government is that public-private partnerships, that type of money, is not classified as public debt, but is classified as private debt, which means from the incumbent government's point of view, it's very appealing because essentially you can deliver infrastructure or public services to your citizenry without that counting as part of your sovereign debt. Which is can be a very attractive option for governments of all types, but particularly if you're facing fiscal constraints, for example. So yeah, I just wanted to quickly add that, as I think that's quite a fundamental issue.
So I guess that often leads to a concern that that kind of contracting, the public-private partnerships, and we'll get onto in more detail in just a moment to what that is, but that can be a kind of symptom of governmental short-termism, that it's a way through which governments can get stuff in the short term while they're in power, and then paying for it will happen down the line when some other government is in power. Is that a fair criticism, do you think?
I think that is a fair criticism, and it's definitely something that governments can be accused of having done, because essentially you can start procuring for various types of infrastructure, and then when further down the line maybe cost overruns start occurring or delays, it's then out of your hands potentially and in the hands of the next government that's come through. So I think that is a fair criticism.
Yeah, just to jump in on that quickly, I think we've seen the same thing happening in the kind of world of traditional contracting. So there isn't necessarily the same financing structure, but a service is simply outsourced to the private sector. And often that comes with a short-term cost saving. So the private sector quote that they can do it much, much more cheaply than the public sector. But what we're starting to see, and, we've had in the UK, for instance, around 30 years now of kind of quite a lot of public sector contracting, is over time, other costs start to kind of creep in, particularly monitoring costs. So often the in-house team is compared directly with the contractor, but what actually ends up happening is you need to keep a substantial portion of resource in-house in order to just monitor that the contractor's doing what they say they're going to do. And often governments have not been particularly good at doing that, or good at attracting the kind of skills needed to manage these kind of big contracts. And the people and the skills required to do that are sometimes quite expensive. So you see kind of an initial cost saving, but over the kind of decades, the monitoring and ancillary costs start to mount up quite a lot.
Very interesting. We're already talking here about various different kinds of contracts, different sorts of relationships between government and suppliers. Ellie, can you just help us understand these? So you focus particularly on public-private partnerships, PPPs. What are these, and how do they differ from other kinds of contractual arrangements?
Yeah, of course. So essentially, as we have already touched upon, public-private partnerships are a mechanism for the government to be able to procure and implement public infrastructure or services using the resources and expertise of the private sector. So they essentially collect the financing, construction, and operation of assets into these long-term contractual arrangements, which in theory brings with it efficiency gains, as we've just been talking about. To fix ideas, a very simple example is to think about a toll bridge. So the idea is that if you contract out to the same consortium this toll bridge, they are likely to construct it better, knowing that they're then going to be operating the toll bridge in the future. So they would want to build a good bridge that isn't going to have problems and is going to cost them as little as possible when they're then running it later. So the idea is that you get these efficiencies coming through bundling, is what it's called technically in the contractual kind of way of thinking about things. And there are multiple different forms that these contracts can take. So in the book that you mentioned at the beginning, Alan, we look across the globe at what these types of contracts look like. And we see that the most popular type of PPP is what's called a build, own, operate, which is a particular type of contract that's often used for water treatment or power plants, because essentially a given consortium builds it, then has the ownership rights as well as operating it. Whereas you'd see different flavors of these contracts used for different types of infrastructure, for example, build, own, transfer, or there are multiple different types of contracts that I won't go into because there are many of them and they're maybe not that interesting. But essentially, yeah, the reason they're interesting is because this umbrella of public-private partnerships rely on private finance and involve the private sector assuming some of the risk for delivering public goods and services. That's the kind of key takeaway.
Okay, great. And Alice, you work on other kinds of arrangements. What other sorts of arrangements should we be aware of in our discussion here?
Yeah, so there are kind of a myriad of different kind of flavors of contracting, but I'm just going to touch on kind of three new styles that I think are quite important, some of which have been relevant in the COVID pandemic. So, of course, the kind of contracting that I described at the beginning is just a simple contract where where the government pays an external provider to provide a service on its behalf. So that's kind of the basic type. But more recently, we're seeing kind of different forms of contracts, such as framework agreements. So these are contracts where a provider will bid for the opportunity to provide future contracts. So basically, what they're doing is going through all the kind of rigmarole and procedures to be awarded a contract, so that they can be the provider of any particular contractual need for a public organisation in the future. And this is sort of a way to circumvent some of the more onerous procurement procedures that the EU puts in place. So you only have to go through them once, and then every time a government organisation or for example, a local authority needs that particular service, they can just kind of call it off from a selection of providers. So those are quite frequently used and are slightly different to traditional contracting. Another kind of development that we've seen is an increase in subcontracting. And this has been come to light particularly in the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is where the government will contract with one provider, but that provider will actually then subcontract. So they will then have providers themselves that sort of do the work for them. And a lot of the PPE sourcing contracts were set up this way. So the government was not necessarily engaging somebody to supply PPE to them directly, but they were engaging someone to go out and hunt for and find all the different PPE that they could. And this is another way that the government could kind of transfer risk onto a provider because they're taking on the kind of risk of supplying the contract when perhaps supply is quite uncertain, as we've seen recently. But this kind of subcontracting can also have pitfalls, and we saw this with the collapse of Carillion. The fact that a lot of their contracts were heavily subcontracted led to really kind of really increased the impact that collapse had, because lots of downstream suppliers then didn't get paid, and there was a real impact on kind of job losses and things like that. And then just finally, the kind of contracts that I look at in my research is something called relational contract. This is a kind of new style of contracting, say, where instead of writing out everything that possibly could kind of happen or go wrong or needs to be determined in writing, they're a lot more open, and this allows you to deal with situations where, for example, the service or the task to be done is very difficult to describe, or you're dealing with a lot of uncertainty, so you might not know what you'll need, 6 months from now, something like that. And what organisations have started to do is to, rather than writing reams and reams and reams of documents that will never be read and are very unenforceable, is to do a more bare bones contract and then continually negotiate. And these have been very popular in the US. The legal environment there means that it's easier for public organisations in the US to draw these up, but we're just starting to see them in Europe and particularly the UK. And I think kind of post Brexit, we might start seeing more of this in the UK as the UK kind of reforms its procurement environment. So those are maybe something to look out for, and we can talk a bit more about the pitfalls of those perhaps later on in the episode.
Absolutely. And just listening to both of you, it's striking the range of examples that you're providing. I mean, there's a huge range of different kinds of services that are provided in these ways, different sorts of infrastructure projects. So we're talking transport infrastructure, energy infrastructure, maintenance of all sorts of different things, provision of all sorts of different kinds of services. I mean, in a sense, I guess the question might be, what isn't subject to this kind of contracting provision and partnership between public and private sector bodies rather than what is? Do we have any sense, Ellie, do you want to go for this? Do you have any sense of what the boundaries are here?
Yeah, so for PPPs, it's often for large scale infrastructure. So I guess one kind of helpful dimension might be thinking about size. So if you're talking about, as I mentioned before, like water plants or energy plants, they're often delivered through PPPs, whereas for kind of more smaller scale or simpler, I guess, tasks, like if as a government department you need to buy some pencils, you probably wouldn't use a PPP to do that. You just use a sort of simpler form of contracting out. But yeah, so that's at least PPPs tend to be used for these large-scale infrastructure projects, so like roads, like I mentioned, bridges, solar or wind energy plants, schools, hospitals, all these types of projects. Although that does vary across the globe. Again, in our book, we look at this, and you can see across the globe, in fact, in like Europe, the Americas, and Asia, wind and solar are the main sectors in which you see PPPs being used. But that does change across the globe. So if you look, for example, in Asia, coal, energy, and mass transit systems are still the most kind of broadly provided through PPPs. And in Africa, solar and hydro types of projects are provided using PPP. So you do see how the way that a country, what its economy looks like, its geography looks like, will affect the types of projects that PPPs are used for. But on the whole, I'd say large-scale infrastructure is essentially what you see PPPs being used for.
And Alice, presumably some of the other kinds of contracting that you've set out there are used more for shorter term service provision, that kind of thing. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've definitely seen a big shift in what is acceptable to contract, kind of politically, and what is potentially kind of up for contracting. Because the services that were initially targeted for contracting out were what we might call simple services, so or technical services like cleaning and security. Although obviously there's lots of complexity and work that needs to go into that. But they were services that were already provided by private sector companies. So they were services that, such as cleaning, where there was already a market. People were already doing these things. Like security, there were already security companies, and they were relatively easy to define and measure. So it was relatively easy to set targets for these companies. In the last, I would say, couple of decades, we've seen kind of contracting being extended into more complex services, but also services that kind of we would traditionally think of being as kind of core parts of government. So a kind of really obvious example here is prisons. The justice system, and as a result of that, imprisoning somebody is one of the core functions of any government. And yet here and in places like the US, we're seeing kind of privatization and contracting in particular being extended into areas like prisons. And this comes with a myriad of problems, because obviously the outcomes there are much more complex, kind of more fuzzy. For example, something like rehabilitation is quite difficult to measure. And kind of some other examples of these kind of areas are things like benefits assessment, so the work capability assessment that takes part that you have to go through if you're going to claim employment support allowance. That part of now universal credit is actually outsourced. So you see kind of increasingly private companies, making decisions about how citizens are treated, and the kind of state services they can actually access, which I think is a really kind of important development and kind of interesting for questions about kind of what governments do and how they do it.
Yes, definitely. Great. So we've got a lot of background material here. We've got a sense of what it is that we're talking about, and how things have developed over time, how these different arrangements are being used, and so on. I guess all of that leads to maybe the most important question, which is what actually works? What works best? Which is obviously a really broad question. Ellie, how do we even get our heads around what that question means in the first place?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and in fact, there's a pretty heated debate in the scholarly literature about this. So there is a very large literature that's focused on evaluating essentially whether sort of traditional procurement methods or PPPs perform better or worse, and this is usually in terms of time, so how long the time frame in which it takes you to deliver a public good, and also cost. So how much is this costing the taxpayer and the government overall? And essentially, the kind of bottom line from all of this research, rather unhelpfully, is that there isn't a huge difference, or if there is, it depends quite significantly from type of project to type of project, from sector to sector, and across different contexts, so from country to country or region to region, depending on the political system. So, theoretically, there are sort of conditions under which PPPs, so I'm talking about PPPs, this is what I've focused on mostly, make more sense and are more likely to be successful. And by successful, I again mean to be finished on time and to cost less or the same as traditional public procurement. And that's usually, so this kind of links into what Alice was talking about, links to the extent to which you can write a complete contract. So the idea is that if the government has done this type of project numerous times in the past and it's relatively simple, you can write quite a complete contract that means that you can allocate risk clearly between the public sector and the private companies, and therefore you can mitigate some of the negative effects that would come with renegotiating, for example. So it's very interesting to hear Alice talking about relational contracting, because in the PPP world, that can be extremely costly for the taxpayer and has led, particularly, there are lots of studies from Latin America about this, to very bad outcomes for the taxpayer, because you don't want to see private partners coming in and renegotiating, and therefore kind of they give a great deal at the beginning of the process, and then this becomes increasingly more expensive. So in those types of situations where you have a clear idea of the type of project that you need to deliver, they can be effective, but the problem is we are moving towards lots of different types of public services that are very complex. Like the world that we live in is complex. We have pandemics, technology, privacy, all kinds of things to navigate, and as that happens, it becomes difficult for contracting to kind of keep up. So essentially, it's a difficult question, and there unfortunately isn't really a clear answer, which I would argue, but maybe we can talk about this later, would mean that you might want to exercise more caution in using PPPs, for example, given that their performance record is rather mixed. And I'm happy to talk about that in a moment if we want to talk about where they are around the world, but I should let Alice jump in as well.
Well, just before that, I'm intrigued that the criteria that you've talked about there are finishing on time and at lower cost than would have been the case otherwise. And I guess a lot of the concern that's often expressed about these sorts of arrangements is that quality is harmed. And Alice was talking about the kind of fuzzier, harder to measure outputs, and that kind of quality is missed from these sorts of arrangements. Do we have any evidence on that?
So again, the issue is it tends to be pretty difficult to measure. So unless you're looking at the exact same type of project across different countries, for example, or you could look within a particular sector and try and compare, it's very difficult. So again, in the book that I mentioned, we create a measure of quality, but because we're looking across the globe and comparatively, it's very difficult to have a kind of a measure that you can be confident is going to be accurate for the multiple types, given that, as we've mentioned, these types of procurement contracts cover a huge different range of goods and services and across the globe. It's very difficult to kind of pin that down. But in terms of, so the literature that I'm kind of aware of can either do that very well in a case study context, but it's very difficult to do that comparatively. I don't know if Alice has thoughts on that, but that's my...
Alan's really hit on probably one of the core problems for this area of research, because all the things we've been talking about how these quality outcomes are difficult to measure, and of course, if they're difficult to measure, they usually don't show up in administrative data, because if the government were able to access and measure them, then we wouldn't have this problem in the first place. So the kind of holy grail for academic researchers in this area is kind of trying to find kind of measures of quality that can do this. I think it's definitely still a work in progress, but there are some people out there kind of doing quite innovative work. And I think the case study method, I think this is where kind of qualitative research kind of comes into its own, because it can examine that kind of thing in detail, kind of on the ground.
Let's get on to some of the research that you have been able to do.
Yes.
So, Alice, you've investigated whether governments repeatedly going back to the same suppliers, whether that is a good thing or a bad thing. What have you been able to find there?
So basically, I've done this piece of research based on UK contracting data that's kind of published through the EU. And what was interested in is whether yes, the government kind of working with suppliers that it's already worked with has any kind of impact on future competition. So my theory is that if you're a prospective competitor, if you see that a contract is repeatedly being awarded to company X, then you'll look at that and think, I might not submit a bid this time. I think my efforts are better served by going for this other contract. And of course, these processes are quite kind of cumbersome and onerous for the companies. It takes a lot of effort and work to kind of go through process of bidding for a contract. And so what I do is I identify in this data kind of relationships over time between government organisations and private companies. And what I'm able to do is track whether, having awarded the contract repeatedly to one supplier or possibly a small number of suppliers, as contracts are often awarded to a couple of suppliers at the same time, then has any impact on competition in the future. And what I find is that this does, but only in contracts where quality criteria are involved in the contract award. So where contracts are awarded solely based on price, this doesn't happen. But where contracts are awarded on both price and quality, which I have to say is the norm. Usually there are some quality criteria for very good reasons. This kind of the strength of prior relationships, stronger prior relationships have a negative effect on future competition. Kind of, I use this finding to develop the argument that basically what this is that where public servants have some element of discretion in how they award the contract, awarding it frequently to the same set of suppliers dissuades potential competitors for bidding for that contract. And this is really important because, as I said at the beginning, competition is one of the core rationales for doing this in the first place. So, what I'm working on now is kind of taking that another step further and seeing what the effect on kind of end performance is. But even on its own, I think it's really significant that this practice is kind of undermining one of the core rationales for contracting, and so kind of. I use that to argue that it's kind of not enough to just rely on competition being out there. Often public contracts struggle with uncompetitive markets. And so public organisations and governments should really be looking at kind of other rationales for contracting. Do they need to access expertise from the private sector? Is there some benefit to kind of learning about new ways of working, having kind of institutional diversity, these kind of other maybe more neglected rationales for the practice, and perhaps if there isn't, maybe we should be scaling back our use of this practice.
Ellie, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the book that I mentioned previously kind of fits pretty well with what Alice is working on. So we there take a more kind of macro look at this across the globe, and we're looking at what we call partnership communities, which are essentially we're looking at networks. So how those private partners involved in public-private partnerships are connected between one another. And what we see is something very similar to what Alice describes. So you would kind of want these networks of private partners to function like markets in a kind of ideal world, right? You want competition and people to be able to, so that the public can get the best contracts available. But what we see is that over time, these the networks of partners tend to become more concentrated. And this is particularly true in the UK. For example, we focus in on a comparison between the UK and the US, which is indicative on a kind of macro scale of the same types of dynamics that Alice is talking about. So that as these networks establish themselves into communities, you essentially see the same partners getting these types of projects essentially, and therefore getting a kind of greater market share, which is matching up with the rest of the literature, which argues that these types of big contracts often suffer from a lack of competition. So you have few private partners or consortia able to deliver these types of projects, can become quite problematic in terms of thinking about who kind of holds the power and is able to decide which projects go ahead and under what kind of terms. And another strand of research that I look into is, in all of this, we haven't really spoken about voters and what citizens think about these ways of contracting out, which I believe is important. And I have a couple of projects where I look at this. So in one, I use a survey experiment of American citizens in this case, to essentially ask if they're sensitive to the way in which you deliver a public good or service. And what I find is that they are. But when you introduce performance information, so giving them some information about how successful or not the delivery of this infrastructure was, and that then becomes, they don't care about that. What they care about is the performance, which makes a lot of sense. But what I do find, which I think is interesting, is that what we classify as more kind of highly politically knowledgeable citizens are more sensitive to private involvement in the delivery of public goods and services, which I think is really important to voters are aware of these projects. They know that they're happening, and they do seem to have preferences for the way in which you deliver them. And in another project I focus on the case of Colombia, where there have been some very high profile kind of disasters with PPPs. And we find there as well that essentially they don't always function as credit claiming opportunities, which is what the sort of distributive politics literature would expect. So you'd imagine that as a politician, I send a project to a given district, and you would hope that would gain you votes, right? Like you're providing some infrastructure. But what we find is that in these cases where there's been quite a negative association with PPPs, voters do react to that, and they are less likely to vote for the incumbent. Which I think it's really important that we think about how, what voters' preferences are, particularly as we've sort of touched upon throughout the conversation. There are costs associating with, you're essentially kind of blurring the line, right, of accountability between who's delivering the public good. Is it the government kind of writ large, or are there these private partners involved? And I think it's really important that we take that into consideration, particularly given, as I mentioned before, that PPPs, in my case, do have quite a mixed performance record. So you can't justify their use purely on kind of efficiency gain logic. So you also have to take into account, in my opinion, the costs that they might have for democracy, for example, which is maybe a big statement, but I think it's really important to kind of think about these types of questions.
Yeah, and I guess it also gets to the point that, the public might not be terribly concerned about the details of political process, but they definitely don't want that process to be hijacked for private gain. And I guess there's a real perception that sometimes these kinds of arrangements can be used by either by private private companies, or by ministers and officials in government, precisely in order to extract private gain from the system. Which I suppose, again, going back to what I started with in my intro to this episode, and some of the controversy over PPE contracts and so on at the early stages of the pandemic, that was exactly the kind of concern that was talked about there. Alice, do you have any final thoughts for us?
Yeah, I was just thinking, based on what you said about PPEs, I think most of the time this is a subject that maybe goes under the radar a little bit. And when I first started my research, I told people what I was going to do, and they said, "Oh, you're doing your PhD on bin collection? Great!" It really seems like a very prosaic topic, but when it goes wrong and when it impacts the taxpayer, then it does become hugely politically salient. And I mean, it does touch on kind of one of the key relationships between citizens and the state, because public services are how we all experience government in our lives, and whether that's being delivered kind of directly by the government or by a private company that's doing it for profit, I think does have a really big impact. And when things go wrong, that can become incredibly important to people and incredibly salient.
Yeah, well, thank you so much to both of you. It's been really fascinating. It isn't the most glamorous topic, but it's incredibly important, and you have made the case for that very, very clearly. And so thank you both.
Thank you for having us, Alan.
Thank you. And if you'd like to read more, we'll put the details of Ellie's book in the show notes for this episode. It's called Partnership Communities, Public-Private Partnerships and Non-Market Infrastructure Development Around the World. Written by Anthony Michael Bertelli, Eleanor Florence Woodhouse, Michele Castiglioni, and Paolo Bellardinelli. And it was published in 2021 by Cambridge University Press. Alice's work is yet to appear in the public domain, but watch this space. Next week, we're looking at the impact of intermarriage on voting behaviour in Africa. As ever, to make sure you don't miss out on that or other future episodes of UCL Uncovering Politics, all you need to do is subscribe. You can do so on Apple, Spotify, or whatever podcast provider you use. I'm Alan Rennick. Our producer is Abby Turner. Our theme music is written and performed by John Mann. This has been UCL Uncovering Politics. Thank you for listening.